When I was 10, my parents packed their suitcases and left me standing on Grandma's porch. They didn't even look back when the door closed behind them. I still remember the sound of the car engine fading into the distance louder than any goodbye they never said. My name is Sienna Holt, and that was the day I learned silence could hurt more than words. They told Grandma they had a long-term business trip, but the truth was simpler. They just didn't want me. I waited on that porch for hours, clutching my little backpack, thinking maybe they would change their minds. They never did. Grandma took my hand and led me inside her small house on the corner of Maple Street. She didn't say much, just poured me a cup of cocoa and said, "You'll be okay, my little sunshine." Her voice shook a little, but her eyes didn't. That's when I realized she knew they weren't coming back either. That night, I sat by the window and counted headlights passing through the dark, hoping one of them was my parents returning. It took me years to understand that they had already left long before that night, not just from my life, but from the idea of being parents at all. Before I tell you what happened 10 years later, please subscribe and share your thoughts, because what came next completely changed the way I see family and what it really means to be loved. Life with Grandma moved at its own gentle rhythm. The mornings began with the smell of brewed coffee and the soft hum of her old radio playing country songs from decades ago. She would sway slightly as she stirred oatmeal or sliced apples for her pie, the light from the window catching the silver strands in her hair. I often followed her into the garden where rows of tomatoes grew beneath the sun and bees drifted lazily between flowers. The yard was small, yet in that quiet corner of Fort Collins, it felt like an entire world designed to keep me safe. Grandma Evelyn carried herself with calm determination, and she made me believe that life, even when ordinary, could still be meaningful. Afternoons belonged to Aunt Helen. She arrived with chalk dust on her sleeves, her teacher's voice still gentle but firm. She would sit beside me at the kitchen table reviewing my essays or teaching me how to read maps. She called me Bright Eyes, a nickname that embarrassed me at first, but secretly, I cherished it. Between her laughter and Grandma's stories, I began to feel less like a forgotten child and more like someone who belonged somewhere. Still, the nights brought questions I couldn't silence. Every year I sent birthday cards to my parents, decorating each one carefully with drawings of flowers or mountains. I imagined them opening my letters, smiling, maybe even framing one on their wall. But weeks passed, then months, and no reply ever came. I tried to believe the mail had been lost, though deep down I knew it hadn't. One evening, while helping Grandma clean her bookshelf, I discovered a postcard from my father. It described his new job and a beach trip, cheerful and distant. My name wasn't mentioned. The silence of that absence stung more than any cruel word. Grandma took the card gently and looked at me. "Some people think love is automatic," she said. "It isn't. Blood means nothing if love doesn't follow." Her words sank deep into me, quiet but permanent. After that night, I stopped waiting by the mailbox. Instead, I poured my time into the life we had. We baked pies for the neighbors, watched old movies on Fridays, and sang along to the radio when no one else could hear. I began to realize that family wasn't something you were given, it was something you built moment by moment with those who stayed. 4 years later, a phone call broke the peace Grandma had built. It was late afternoon, and sunlight spilled through the curtains when Aunt Helen answered the phone in the kitchen. I watched her expression shift from calm to pale, her hand tightening around the receiver. After a long silence, she whispered a thank you and turned toward me. Her voice trembled slightly as she said that Grandma Evelyn had been taken to the hospital. The doctors believed it was her heart worn out from years of quiet strength and too much kindness. We packed a small bag and drove to the hospital that evening. The white corridors smelled of antiseptic and something colder, a kind of stillness that felt unfamiliar to me. When I saw Grandma lying in bed, small and fragile beneath the sheets, I suddenly realized how much of my world rested on her existence. She smiled weakly when she noticed me, her hand reaching for mine. "You'll be fine, sweetheart," she said, her voice faint but certain. The nurse explained that Grandma would need extended rest and might not be able to take care of me for a while. Aunt Helen's eyes filled with worry. She was a teacher with long hours and limited time, so she decided to call my mother Margaret, hoping she could help until Grandma recovered. For several days, there was no answer. Then one evening, Margaret finally called back. I could hear Aunt Helen's polite but strained tone as she explained the situation. There was a pause, and then my mother agreed to come. 2 days later, my parents arrived in Fort Collins. Their car pulled into the hospital parking lot just as the sun was setting. It was strange seeing them again after so many years. Margaret looked older, her hair shorter, and her perfume too strong. Russell's voice was steady but distant when he greeted me. They asked a few polite questions about school, then stood by Grandma's bedside speaking as if she were a stranger. Grandma thanked them for coming and told them I needed a place to stay. Margaret hesitated, glancing at Russell, then finally nodded. Family should stay together, she said, her tone carefully measured. They took me home with them that evening, promising to visit Grandma every week. Their house felt larger than I remembered, full of polished furniture and framed photographs that did not include me. My room smelled of fresh paint, as if prepared for someone new, rather than a daughter returning home. The first night, Margaret made dinner while Russell read the newspaper. We sat at the table, 3 people sharing a meal in silence. I tried to start a conversation, but every answer was short, every question deflected. The clinking of cutlery was louder than our voices. I noticed how they avoided looking at each other, how their smiles were practiced, not warm. The air in that house carried a weight I couldn't name. It wasn't anger or cruelty, but something emptier, a quiet distance that made me miss even the squeak of Grandma's old rocking chair. I helped with chores, kept my grades up, and tried to believe this was temporary. At night, I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, wondering if they ever thought about the years they had missed. Sometimes, when I passed by their bedroom, I could hear them arguing in low voices about money, about work, about things I didn't understand. Their world had no space for me. I often found myself thinking about the hospital room, about Grandma's thin fingers squeezing mine, about Aunt Helen's comforting voice reading aloud beside her bed. Those sounds had warmth. The ones in this house were sharp and cold. I tried to make myself useful, cooking, cleaning, pretending everything was fine, but inside I felt invisible. Every dinner was a repetition of silence. Every morning began with separate routines and closed doors. There was no laughter, no gentle teasing, no humming radio in the background. It was a house filled with people, but not a home. One Sunday, Margaret asked me to join her for a walk. We walked along the neighborhood path lined with trees and tidy lawns. She talked about the weather, about neighbors, about nothing that mattered. I nodded politely, but the space between us felt like miles. When she touched my shoulder and said she was trying her best, I didn't know how to answer. Maybe she believed it, or maybe she just wanted to believe it. When we returned, Russell was on the porch scrolling through his phone, barely glancing up. That moment, I understood that love could not be forced into existence. Some relationships remained broken no matter how long you waited. That night, as I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, I missed the sound of Grandma's laughter more than anything else. I missed the smell of her apple pie, the creak of the wooden floor, and the way Aunt Helen's voice softened when she said goodnight. I realized that home was not about walls or blood, it was about warmth, and I was living in a place that had none. On my 16th birthday, Dad looked at me the way you look at a problem you can't solve. The candles on my cake flickered between us, their small flames doing more talking than he did. Mom stood behind him, arms folded, her smile thin and uneasy. She said they had something important to tell me, something that might take time to understand. I waited, my hands cold despite the summer heat. Then Russell cleared his throat and told me that he and Margaret were moving overseas for work. They said it as if reading from a prepared script, their voices too calm, too deliberate. I stared at them, unsure I had heard correctly. Both of you? I asked. They nodded in perfect sync. For a moment, I thought it was a test, maybe a cruel joke. But the next morning, the house was already filled with boxes. Furniture was labeled with masking tape, and Mom was on the phone discussing prices with buyers. They moved through the rooms with clinical precision, selling off pieces of a life that barely included me. When I asked what would happen to me, Mom smiled and said they would send money every month so I could continue school. "It's only temporary," she said, but her tone sounded final. I followed them around that day, hoping someone would explain what temporary meant. When I finally gathered enough courage, I asked, "Can I come?" The question hung in the air, heavy and small. Neither of them looked at me. Dad pretended to check his watch. Mom rearranged a stack of envelopes. Their silence was louder than any answer. I went upstairs and closed the door before they could see me cry. Through the window, I watched them load boxes into a van, their movements efficient and detached. A few days later, Aunt Helen came to the house. She had heard from a neighbor and wanted to speak with them before they left. When she arrived, Russell met her at the door, irritation already in his eyes. She told him this wasn't right, that family doesn't abandon its own. He cut her off sharply, saying she had no right to interfere. His words were sharp and final, and even from the stairs I could hear every one of them. Aunt Helen stood her ground, her voice trembling with anger, but he ordered her to leave. She refused at first, then looked up and saw me standing halfway down the steps. Her expression softened, but she couldn't reach me. That night, the house felt emptier than ever. The next morning, there was a folded note on the kitchen table. It was written in Mom's neat handwriting, short and distant. They had left early to catch their flight. The note asked Aunt Helen to take me back to Grandma's house until things settled down. I read it twice, then pressed it flat with my palm, trying to understand how people could leave without saying goodbye. An hour later, a taxi stopped outside. Through the curtain, I saw them loading the last of their suitcases. Mom adjusted her sunglasses while Dad handed cash to the driver. I wanted to run out to scream, to ask why they couldn't even look at me. But something inside me froze. My body wouldn't move. The door stayed closed. I stood by the window watching the taxi pull away, its wheels kicking up dust on the street. The sound of the engine faded, leaving only the stillness of the house behind. Aunt Helen arrived not long after, her face pale with disbelief. She found me sitting at the table with the note beside me. She didn't ask questions. She just placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Let's go home." I packed what little I had left, some books, clothes, and the small photo of Grandma and me in the garden. When we stepped outside, the air felt strange, as if even the wind knew something had ended. As the car rolled away, I looked back one last time. The curtains were still drawn, the front door locked, and the for sale sign leaned against the mailbox. The house where my parents lived had become a shell, a place where love had never taken root. For a long time, I stared at the shrinking shape of the neighborhood, trying to memorize every detail before it vanished from view. Deep down, I already knew that was the last time I would ever see them. The next years became a test I didn't know I was taking. After my parents left, life forced me to grow faster than I was ready for. Aunt Helen welcomed me back with quiet strength, and though she never spoke ill of Margaret or Russell, her eyes told me she would never forgive them. She worked long hours at school, and I wanted to ease her burden, so I found a part-time job at a cafe near downtown Fort Collins. Mornings started before sunrise with the smell of roasted beans and the hiss of the espresso machine. I wiped tables, took orders, and studied during slow hours. The customers were kind, and the tips helped me feel like I could stand on my own. When classes ended, I spent evenings sketching floor plans and color palettes, slowly realizing I had a gift for spaces that felt alive. Aunt Helen noticed my notebooks one night and encouraged me to apply for a design program. She said my hands were made for creating comfort, not just cleaning tables. I laughed, but she handed me the university brochure anyway. Months later, when the letter came, I almost didn't open it. It said I had received a full scholarship to study interior design at Colorado State University. I sat on the porch holding that letter until the sun went down, the paper trembling in my hands. It felt like a door had opened to a world I didn't think existed for someone like me. College was harder than I expected. I balanced classes, my cafe job, and late-night studio projects. But for the first time, exhaustion felt meaningful. My professors saw potential in my work, and one of them recommended me for a small community project, a cafe renovation on College Avenue. I poured everything I had into it, painting, rearranging furniture, creating murals that reflected the town's warmth. When it reopened, the owner cried and hugged me. People started asking who had done the redesign, and my name began to circulate in small circles. It wasn't fame, but it was a beginning. One afternoon, a local designer named Alan Moore visited the cafe. He had seen my work and asked to meet me. I thought he was joking at first. He offered me an internship at his firm in Denver, promising to teach me how creativity survives in the real world. I accepted without hesitation. At his firm, I learned more in 6 months than I had in all my classes. The hours were long, the deadlines relentless, but every finished project filled me with pride. Alan treated me with respect and often said I reminded him of his younger self, hungry, determined, and stubborn. When I turned 21, I rented a small apartment overlooking the river in downtown Denver. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I bought secondhand furniture and decorated every corner with things that told my story, photos of Grandma Evelyn's sketches from college, and a small plant Aunt Helen gave me on moving day. That night, I called Grandma to tell her I had sent money for her roof repair. She laughed softly, saying she didn't need it, but I insisted. "You built my home before I could build one," I told her. She didn't answer right away, but I could hear the pride in her breathing. As years passed, my name began appearing in magazines and online articles. My designs focused on warmth and simplicity, spaces where people could breathe and feel seen. Then came the biggest moment. The Denver Design Association awarded me Young Designer of the Year. Standing on stage under bright lights, I remembered the girl who once served coffee to strangers and drew dreams in the margins of notebooks. When I looked down at the glass trophy, I realized it wasn't just about design. It was proof that I had survived everything meant to break me. That evening, Alan hosted a small celebration at his studio. He raised a toast to the girl who turned absence into art. Everyone laughed, but my eyes stung. Later, when I went home, I stood by the window watching the city lights shimmer across the water. For the first time, I felt peace instead of longing. I was no longer the girl waiting for love to return. I was the woman who built her own version of it, one wall, one color, one home at a time. 10 years later, my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen since I was 16. For a few seconds, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The name Mom glowed softly on the screen, framed by the same contact photo. I had never changed a blurry image from my 10th birthday. My hand froze above the phone. I could hear my heartbeat louder than the ringtone. When I finally answered, her voice came through with a calmness that didn't belong to her. "Sienna, sweetheart," she said gently, "it's been such a long time." I didn't know how to respond. The last memory I had of Margaret was her walking away without looking back. Now she spoke as if the years between us had never existed. She said they were back in Fort Collins for a while, that they wanted to meet and make things right. Her tone was smooth, almost rehearsed, and I could feel the practiced warmth in every word. For a moment, part of me wanted to believe her. But another part, the older, stronger part, knew better. That evening, I drove to Aunt Helen's house. She opened the door before I could knock, her eyes narrowing when she saw my face. "They called, didn't they?" she asked. I nodded. She sighed, sat down at the kitchen table, and poured 2 cups of tea. "They never call without a reason," she said. "Be careful, Sienna. People who vanish for a decade don't just come back for love." I stared into my cup, watching the steam rise and twist, wishing I could tell her she was wrong, but I couldn't. For 2 nights, I avoided the decision. I ignored follow-up messages that were polite, yet persistent. Margaret wrote that they had missed me every day, that they wanted to see how well I had done. It was the kind of message someone sends when they've already rehearsed the outcome. Finally, on the third morning, I replied with a short, "Okay, 1 hour, downtown cafe." I told myself I was meeting them to close the chapter, not to reopen it. Before leaving, I called Ben, my closest friend and the only person who knew the full story. He had been there during the hardest years of college, the one who cheered me through sleepless nights and deadlines. When I told him about the call, there was a long silence on the line. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked. I said yes, though I wasn't sure at all. "Then I'm coming with you," he said. I told him not to interfere, just to be nearby. "Moral support," he replied. "Nothing more." The cafe was small, tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop. The smell of fresh pastries mingled with the low hum of conversations. I sat by the window facing the street, my hands wrapped around a mug I hadn't touched. Every time the door opened, my heart jumped. Ben sat a few tables away, pretending to scroll through his phone but glancing up every few minutes. I tried to steady my breathing, reminding myself that I wasn't 16 anymore, that I had built a life beyond their reach. Then the door opened again and the air seemed to shift. 2 figures stepped inside. It took only a second to recognize them. Russell walked in first, still upright but thinner, the sharp lines of his face carved deeper by time. Margaret followed closely, her hair shorter, dyed to hide the gray, her posture slightly stooped, yet still composed. Their clothes looked expensive, but their expressions were cautious, measuring the room before finding me. For an instant I thought I saw hesitation in Margaret's eyes, but it vanished quickly, replaced by something else, something familiar. It wasn't guilt. It was calculation. They smiled as they approached, the kind of smile people wear when they're about to ask for something. I stood up, heart pounding, unsure whether to shake their hands or walk away. Margaret reached out first, her voice soft and steady. "You've grown into such a beautiful woman, Sienna. We're so proud of you." Her words floated between us, sweet and empty. Russell nodded, adding, "We've heard about your success. Denver, right? That's amazing." In that moment, I realized Aunt Helen had been right. They hadn't called because they missed me. They had called because they needed something. And for the first time, I wasn't the little girl waiting to be chosen. I was the woman who finally understood what goodbye had meant 10 years ago. Then Russell cleared his throat. "It has been quite some time," he began, his tone carefully measured. "We have been through a lot overseas. The travel company we invested in collapsed last year. It was a large operation, European tours, partnerships all gone. We lost almost everything." He paused, as if waiting for sympathy that would never come. Margaret sighed softly and added, "It was supposed to be temporary. But things spiraled out of control. We just need a little help getting back on our feet." I listened without interrupting, my hands resting on the warm surface of my mug. His words came out rehearsed, practiced, like a pitch. Then the truth emerged in pieces. "We thought maybe you could help us," Sienna, Russell said, forcing a smile. "You're successful now, and we're proud of that. Maybe you could invest in restarting the company. It would mean the world to us." I blinked slowly, my chest tightening, realizing what this meeting truly was. They hadn't returned for reconciliation. They had come for money. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes glassy but sharp. "We're still family," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "You wouldn't let family drown, would you?" The manipulation was so familiar, it almost made me laugh. I had heard the same tone when I was a child, every time they needed me to behave, every time love was something to be earned. My throat tightened, but I kept my voice steady. "I'm not your lifeline," I said quietly. "You left me when I was 10 and again when I was 16. Don't ask me to save you now." Russell's expression hardened instantly, the mask of humility slipping. "That's unfair," he said, raising his voice slightly. "We did what we had to do. You don't understand the kind of pressure we faced. I met his eyes and felt a strange calm settle inside me. You're right, I said. I don't understand abandoning your own child and then calling it pressure. Margaret flinched, her lips parting, but no words came. The air in the cafe thickened. People at nearby tables pretended not to listen, but I could feel their glances. Then suddenly, a familiar voice cut through the tension. I think she understands enough. I turned and saw Aunt Helen standing near the counter, her posture firm and her eyes cold. I hadn't noticed her come in. She walked over slowly, every step deliberate. You two always had excuses, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. You left her, lied to everyone about why, and now you're back because her success makes you remember what you lost. Margaret's cheeks flushed. Helen. This is not your business, she snapped. We're trying to make peace. Helen shook her head. Peace doesn't begin with a checkbook. Her words landed like glass shattering across the table. Russell shifted uncomfortably, muttering something about misunderstandings, but Helen ignored him. She turned to me and placed a hand on my shoulder. You don't owe them anything, she said softly. Not your time, not your forgiveness, and certainly not your money. For a moment, no one spoke. The hum of conversation around us faded into a distant blur. Margaret's eyes filled with desperation as she looked at me. Sienna, please, she whispered. We have nowhere else to go. Her voice cracked, but I no longer felt the pull of pity that had once ruled me. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight lift from my chest. I wish you both peace, I said, keeping my tone calm. But I'm not the solution to your mistakes. Russell stared down at his hands, his shoulders slumping for the first time. Margaret's lips trembled, her eyes wide with disbelief. Aunt Helen remained beside me, silent but steady. I turned toward the door, the sound of my footsteps breaking the stillness. As I stepped outside, the cool air hit my face sharp and freeing. Behind me through the glass, I saw them still sitting there, two figures from another life, smaller than I remembered, trapped in the silence of their own making. The cafe lights reflected faintly in the window, framing their faces in gold. I realized then that some goodbyes don't need words. Sometimes walking away is enough to be heard. Months later, I heard the final chapter of their story. News spread quietly through old acquaintances and online whispers. Russell's company, the one he had tried to resurrect, had collapsed completely. Lawsuits followed, partners demanded repayment, and creditors seized what little remained. Margaret, unable to bear the public fallout, had left him soon after. By the time I heard, they were living in different states, each surviving on the remnants of a life they had once built on ambition and denial. There was no satisfaction in knowing it, only a soft ache, like closing a book that never had a happy ending. I didn't reach out. There was nothing left to say. I focused instead on the people who had never left. Aunt Helen and Grandma Evelyn had become the center of my quiet, peaceful world. That winter, I surprised them with tickets for a 2-week trip to the coast. Grandma's laugh filled the room when she opened the envelope, her eyes glistening with joy. Helen protested, at first insisting it was too much, but I told her it was payback for every meal, every night of comfort they had given me when I had nothing. Go, I said. You both deserve the kind of rest you once gave me. While they were away, I poured myself into building the studio I had always dreamed of. With Ben's help, it became more than just a workspace. It became a reflection of everything I had learned: clean lines, warm light, soft colors, and an atmosphere that felt like forgiveness. Clients came in and told me they felt calm just standing inside, and each time they said it, I felt like some piece of my heart was quietly healing. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Aunt Helen stopped by with takeout and stories from their trip. She looked around the studio, smiling as she brushed her fingers across the oak desk. You didn't lose parents, she said gently. You found yourself. I stood by the window, the city lights flickering beyond the glass, and felt the truth of her words settle deep in me. That night, the sky turned gold and violet, the studio glowing in its last light. I realized that freedom doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it simply appears when the weight finally lifts. For the first time, I wasn't haunted by what I didn't have. I was grateful for what I had built. And as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, I whispered a quiet thank you to the silence that had once hurt me. It had taught me peace.